Hello, and welcome to Book Circle. I'm Earl Weinberg. This time we continue our reading of Early Days by Miss Reed. Work and Play. The Women's Institute had a considerable influence on our lives in those early days at Chelsfield. The movement had been launched nationally not many years before, and my mother joined the local branch soon after we arrived in the village in 1921. I suspect that my father encouraged her in this. Not only was she still recovering from major surgery, and cheerful company was good for her, but used as she was to London and its ways, I think my father may have thought that she might be lonely. Even after their marriage, she had been in close touch with her mother, sisters, and brothers, and immediately before the move to Chelsfield, she had been in daily contact with the family household at 267 Hither Green Lane. My father was away from home from early morning until the evening at his work in an insurance office in North London. It must have been a beast of a journey, probably involving 3 hours at least of the day in tedious traveling, but I never heard him complain. It did mean, though, that my mother was alone except for my half hour with her at lunchtime, and no doubt my father was anxious for her to make friends. The WI was exactly the right place to do this, and had in fact been founded, as everyone knows, with this as one of its main aims. My mother took to it like a duck to water, and very soon found herself secretary, which will come as no surprise to newcomers to villages everywhere. Besides these clerical responsibilities, with which she dealt competently, she was very keen on the other activities offered, and I well remember helping her to manhandle a dreadfully awkward and heavy poof to the reading rooms where upholstery classes were being held. Cookery demonstrations particularly appealed to her, and we were willing guinea pigs when she tried out new recipes on the family. Two which I recall were cheese aigrettes, a sort of savory pancake, and Portuguese soup, which had a good amount of rice and tomatoes in it, and was as sustaining as it was delicious. Friends were soon made, some of them the mothers of my own schoolfellows, including Nora's mother. If my father had entertained any fears about loneliness, they must have been quickly dispelled. The change from life in London suited her. Something of its difference was brought home to me one afternoon when Aunt Rose was visiting us, and she and my mother were talking as they reclined in deck chairs. I lay on the grass, ostensibly reading, but ears cocked to hear the conversation. It turned on my prospects of success in the future scholarship examination. Aunt Rose took an avid interest in our school progress and sometimes passed on a message from our last revered headmistress, Miss Pope, who had taken great pride in Lil's achievements and had hoped fondly that I would emulate her. You see, Aunt Rose went on to say, she may be happy enough at this school, but does she get the same stimulation? I mean, town life has so much more to offer. More people, more points of view, competition with other children. I could have told her that absence of these three things was exactly what I liked best about my new school. I remembered the throngs of people in shops, dodging others on crowded pavements, enduring the racket in a town playground. As for the stimulation of a town scene, it ranked as way down the list compared with the joys and excitement of a country lane or our beloved Oak and Hazelwood. There was much which I had actively hated in the London streets, I knew, as well as the noise. I was frightened of trains thundering over bridges above my head. I was afraid of the street hawkers, rag-and-bone men, cat's meat men, coal men, knife grinders, all, in fact, who bellowed their services or wares with such ferocity. The only good point about town streets was the hoardings with their advertisements, for upon these I could practice my newly acquired skill of reading. My favorite was one advertisement for Nestle's milk, and it showed two cats, one gray-striped and skinny, the other round and white. Behind them was a night sky complete with moon, and below them was the verse, "The ghost of Tabby fed on skim is all the war has left of him, but Nestle's is full cream to the brim." Attractive as I found this poster, chiefly because I adored cats, it could not make up for the many horrors of traveling about London. If this was what Aunt Rose termed stimulation, I could do without it. Besides, I did see people. There were my friends at school, the grown-ups, such as Miss Hill, Mr. Curtis, Mr. Hodsall, and Mr. Stanley, who were kind to me and whose company I enjoyed. And as for aunts, uncles, and cousins, they were frequent visitors and provided a certain amount of gentle competition when we played pat-ball tennis or French cricket. Furthermore, these encounters came in small numbers, often at one-to-one confrontations, with plenty of time to spare and peace in which to savor the relationship. I had seen hordes of children in my old school playground and knew hardly any of them. At Chelsfield, I knew and appreciated them all. I hope that my mother did not take her older sister's words too much to heart. One should always take sister's advice with a pinch of salt. But she was ambitious for her two daughters, and as I have mentioned earlier, I think she may have wondered if my new school would give me as good an education as the old one. She need not have worried. I may have had to go down 2 or 3 standards in arithmetic lessons, but my knowledge of flowers, trees, birds, and animals had burgeoned, and my affection for my new friends grew as steadily as my physical well-being, which flourished in this blissful country setting. Apart from arithmetic, I found the work at school not too arduous. Mr. Clark was not a hard taskmaster, his lessons were interesting, and he encouraged questions. He was of an equable disposition, and I can never remember him in a rage. He had made a comfortable niche for himself in the village and lived in the schoolhouse next door. He took part in village affairs and aired his beautiful bass voice in the church choir. He had a pretty wife, whom we school children only saw rarely, when she was hanging out washing or doing some other job in the garden, which ran alongside the boys' playground. The 2 little boys we often saw playing there or about in the village with their mother. Sometimes they ventured into the playground when the gate in the fence between our property and theirs had been left ajar. I can remember our delight when 2 young faces appeared at the window high above and behind Mr. Clark's desk. Alerted by our mirth and inattention, he soon summed up the situation and dashed out to rescue the intruders. It was as well he did, for they had climbed up 2 or 3 ancient and rickety desks, lodged against the outside wall, and anyone heavier than his 2 toddlers would have capsized them. At that time, quite a lot of written work was done in our exercise books, and general neatness in handwriting was stressed far more than it is these days. Although I never mastered the copperplate writing which my fellows used, I got along pretty swiftly with my script, which now began to join up in a ham-fisted fashion, rather like the Marian Richardson style which became fashionable some 10 years later. One afternoon a week, we had composition lessons, a session heartily disliked by most of the pupils, particularly the boys. I must admit that the subjects set were somewhat pedestrian. A Day at the Sea, Helping Mother, A Trip to London were typical of them. Helping Mother no doubt was meant for us females to tackle. A Trip to London probably did not get many takers, for although we were only some 17 miles from the capital and could see the Crystal Palace winking in the sunshine against the smoky background of the city, there were still a number of children at Chesfield who had never been to London, or, for that matter, on a train to anywhere. I quite enjoyed writing essays and had no difficulty in spelling, probably because I came early to reading. But the boys made heavy weather of literary composition and were forever breaking the silence by asking how to spell yesterday or strawberries or carpenter, the sort of words which I felt impatiently they could easily have worked out for themselves phonetically. Mr. Clark used to take our efforts home and return our books the next day suitably marked in red ink. Occasionally he read aloud from one of them, and if it happened to be mine, I was acutely embarrassed. I still think it is a terrible ordeal to hear or see one's own work in public. Mr. Clark's kind comments on my skill made me cringe. Much easier to bear were the subsequent teasings from the boys about my powers. This teasing was kindly. It had nearly killed them to write half a page on the subject set. That one younger than themselves could scribble 2 or 3 pages struck them as peculiar to the point of being idiotic, and they were suitably indulgent. As time went on, my initial alarm at having to share a classroom with boys gradually faded, and although my closest friends were girls, I began to look more tolerantly at the opposite sex. I admired their physical strength. They were far better at digging, at trimming hedges, at lifting heavy things, and particularly at climbing than we were. The massive elm trees which lined the road near St. Martin's Church housed a noisy colony of rooks, and I watched one of the boys climb to the top of one of the trees to collect a rook's egg. It made me shudder. It makes me shudder now to remember the incident. He descended neatly, the egg in his mouth for safety, and seemed absolutely unmoved by his feat. My own pride in being able to climb our small and accommodating yew tree paled into nothing besides this nonchalant exhibition. On the whole, they were a hardy and agile set, and would have been more agile still, I suspect, but for their tight clothing. Most of them wore thick jackets, some too tight and restricting, and the usual thick leather lace-up boots, often with iron-studded soles, and this meant that they were handicapped when it came to running and jumping. We fared better as girls, in lighter clothing and sandals in the summer, although lace-up boots were generally worn by some in the winter. Wellingtons, for general winter wear, did not come until later. Our diet, by today's standards, would be considered too starchy, and viewing the contents of those lunches carried by my schoolfellows, this was certainly the case. I was lucky to go home to a well-cooked midday meal. As well as the ubiquitous eggs at home, we now had plenty of goat's milk, for 4 goats had been added to the chickens, ducks, and rabbits already kept. There was no shortage of fruit in the village generally, for besides the usual seasonal garden fruit, starting with rhubarb and gooseberries, and continuing throughout the summer months to the last late plums, the fields yielded splendid strawberries, and after the lorries had carted most of the crop up to Covent Garden, the farmers allowed the villagers to glean what was left. We probably ate more than we collected for jam making, but there was always plenty of jewel-bright jars put aside for the winter and to be given to our poor town-bound relations when they visited. On 1 or 2 occasions, I was lucky enough to have my lunch at Groom's, the baker's. My mother made the arrangement. For some reason, she would not be at home, and I was excited at the thought of sitting in solitary state at one of Groom's marble-top tables in front of the counter. No one else ever seemed to have a meal there, although I believe cyclists sometimes came in to refresh themselves with tea and buns in the afternoon. My lunch cost 6pence and was always the same. I had a boiled egg, bread and butter, and a glass of milk. After that, I could choose one of Groom's 3 cakes, a currant bun, a donut, or a fairy cake in a frilled paper case. Plenty of starch there, but no doubt I had an apple from home as well. I could hear sounds from the room beyond the shop, and sometimes a shadow was thrown onto the lace curtain which screened the glass door from prying eyes. Probably the eyes on that side were looking to see how I was getting on. There was a large poster for Mazawattee tea, which intrigued me. It showed an Edwardian lady in a velvet coat to the ground and an enormous hat, reclining on a green seat like those I remembered in London parks. She was dangling a little box from a gloved hand. Naturally, it contained Mazawattee tea, and it was interesting to note that she had no other shopping. Why had she bothered to go to the shops just for that one item? And why had she collapsed on the bench when even a lady as high-born as she obviously was could reasonably have been expected to carry such a tiny parcel without undue strain? Or could she be taking it as a present to a distant friend and was having a rest halfway? Perhaps she had suddenly decided that she could not part with such a treasure after all, and was sitting there before returning home. I should like to have inquired of the girl who brought my lunch and who took my 6pence once I had untied it from the corner of my handkerchief, but I was too shy. I remembered, however, to thank her politely for looking after me, for my mother had pointed out that Groom's did not usually serve lunches, and we were much obliged to Mr. Groom for making an exception in my case. I suppose that lovely lady with her packet of tea ended on a bonfire one day. What a pity. Pageants and people. One of those summers in the early 20s brought a memorable occasion. The West Kent Women's Institute proposed to stage a mammoth pageant showing the history of the area, and it was to take place in the magnificent setting of Lullingstone Castle, only a few miles from the village. The project was well thought out. At this distance of time, I could not say exactly how many scenes were envisaged, but something between a dozen or 20 would be my guess. The first scene was to be about the coming of the Romans, and subsequent scenes showed local incidents in medieval times, a visit by Queen Elizabeth, a Civil War episode, some Georgian scenes, and so on up to the 1920s. The idea was to allot a scene either to one specific institute or several who were uniting to act one particular incident. The scenes were to be allotted by drawing names from a hat, so to speak, so that one had to abide by the luck of the draw. Naturally, when this marvelous event was first mooted, all the ladies hoped for a scene in which they could dress in silks and satins, lace and ribbons, and wear magnificent wigs. The Stuarts were probably first choice, all those long curly wigs and dashing hats with ostrich feathers on the brim. But one or two still had a Victorian dress handed down from a forebear, and it was agreed that little shawls and even bustles could be quite fetching. Imagine the dismay of Chelsfield Women's Institute when it was discovered that they had been picked for Scene 1, the coming of the Romans. All thoughts of ostrich feathers, ringlets, or even plaits with pearls interwoven and wimples had to be abandoned. Luckier institutes would swan about in this splendor, while the Chelsfield contingent would have to be content with clean sacks and old furs hacked into some rough semblance of ancient Britain's clothing. Unless, of course, they were Romans. The best looking would undoubtedly be selected to form a Roman cohort, attired in gold-painted cardboard uniforms and sandals, and whoever in charge at Chelsfield had to decide who should be the ancient Britons and who should be the elegant Romans had a pretty sticky bit of diplomacy before them. After the first disappointment, the local ladies set to with a will, sharing bits of old fur coats, getting excited about lengths of sacking if they were ancient Britons, and studying diagrams of Roman military costume, cardboard, gold paint, and shears at the ready, if they were comely enough to have been chosen for the Roman cohort. Children were needed, of course, as part of the tribe, and Nora and I were delighted to be dressed in the regulation sacks and furs, and to take part with our mothers. Rehearsals were held in the garden of a lovely old house not far from the school called Lily's. I believe it was burnt down some years later. There, on hot afternoons, our mothers and other Britons limped about barefoot, dodging the pebbles on the gravel, and trying to look suitably engrossed in stirring imaginary pots, skinning imaginary rabbits, rocking imaginary babies, and occasionally rebuking their all-too-real, excited children. We loved it all, and when the great day arrived, we piled into lorries supplied by Nora's father and made our way over the hill to Lullingstone Park, laden with various stuffed animals, an awkward pole with SPQR waving at the top for the Romans, pots, pans, large dolls for British babies, and, of course, our picnic lunches. We all agreed that it was a good thing to be on first, for after that we could sit back and enjoy the show. I remember how united we all felt, a real band of sisters out to do our best, and to show the rest of West Kent that Chelsfield was a force to be reckoned with. To be honest, I really don't remember much about the rest of the performance, except that the splendid figure of Queen Elizabeth, played by Lady Hart Dyke, if I remember rightly, on a fine grey horse, against the setting of Lullingstone Castle and acres of Kentish greenery, has remained with me to this day. I remember this pageant when I wrote Village Diary years later. Mrs. Pringle was then cast as an influential ancient Briton, but I don't imagine she enjoyed herself as rapturously as we did over 60 years ago. The feeling of being part of a community, which had been so strong during the preparations for the pageant, was something which those born in the village naturally took for granted. As newcomers from London, it struck us all as something rare and valuable. People's talents were known and respected. If a concert or fete were to be organized, then those in charge knew exactly where to look for support. The former headmaster's daughter could be counted on for a display of dancing in the Isadora Duncan manner. Another girl was good at lettering and would undertake to do the posters. The glee club to which my father and mother belonged would render as required. Someone would be game to recite monologues, which would need to be carefully vetted if the rector was to be present. The cake stall would groan under fruitcakes from Mrs. This, shortbread from Mrs. That, and Victoria sandwiches from my mother, who always had plenty of eggs. What is more, these skills were employed willingly. Part of the fun of a village affair was the work that you put into it, and what each person could contribute was soon summed up. My sister Lil, young as she was soon prevailed upon to play church organ on the odd occasion when the usual organist was absent. I had a more lowly role as organ blower when she was at the keyboard, and pumped a handle up and down in the vestry, one eye on a small weight which traveled between two pencil marks on the wooden screen. If it rose too high, then the air ran out, and bedlam ensued. I learnt to dread Lil's pulling out a stop marked tremulo, for then my little weight fairly galloped to the top mark in a series of bounds. This knowledge of each other's talents extended to their clothes, their eccentricities, their homes and gardens. Neighbors were important and could prove a blessing or a bane according to temperament. As children, we frequently ran errands for nearby grown-ups. On one occasion, our friend Peggy, who shared our yew tree, was dispatched by an elderly neighbor of hers to the local ironmonger at Pratt's Bottom. She was to order an inexpensive enamel slop bowl, and it was to be delivered promptly. This somewhat imperious old lady was the wife of a retired clergyman, and everything had to be done with the greatest rectitude. We accompanied Peggy on her errand, wondering vaguely among ourselves exactly what an inexpensive enamel slop bowl was, and what was its purpose. Peggy thought it was for washing up. One of us hazarded a guess that it was some sort of basin for tea leaves, although why it should be made of enamel, when presumably the rest of the tea set would be china, we could not fathom. "Well, I shall just repeat what she said," said Peggy, "and leave it to the shopman." We agreed that this was all that could be done, and duly delivered the message. Luckily, the proprietor seemed to know what was required, and we retired with relief to pursue our own pleasures. Later, we heard that an enamel chamber pot, not even swathed in paper, had been left on the front doorstep of that respectable house, and poor Peggy and her mother endured the full force of their neighbors' indignation. Relations remained strained for some months, and Peggy went on strike and said she would never go shopping for anyone ever again. She had our sympathy. One of the most welcome errands I was called upon to undertake was the very occasional delivery of a telegram to a nearby neighbor. Mrs. Smith at the post office saw me one lunchtime and asked me to take the yellow envelope to our friends next door to my house. I felt very proud to be entrusted with this official task, and even more overwhelmed when I was given sixpence, evidently the statutory GPO fee for my labors. Sixpence was a fortune then for a child, and no doubt it was rushed to Mrs. Bird's for a pound of Demerara sugar and a quart of desiccated coconut. Not many people received telegrams in those days, and far too few needed to be delivered by me, but what bliss when that occasion came my way. The people I saw most of, naturally, were my schoolfellows. As those 3 happy years slid by, I grew to view them with affection and admiration. In many ways, they were older and wiser than I was. Most of the girls had younger brothers or sisters to look after, or seemed to do more for their parents than I was called upon to do. They were knowledgeable about such mysteries as the source of babies, in which I was not particularly interested, as I had too many enthralling things to do. They noticed clothes, hairstyles, and other people's possessions. The boys were not so much objects of attraction as positive nuisances, demanding attention, being noisy, rough, and sometimes downright vulgar. The girls had a well-developed sense of propriety, and often shocked at things which I sometimes thought merely amusing. The school building became as familiar to me as my own home. I grew fond of the grooves in my desk lid, the knots on the floorboards, the reflection of the high windows and the dark background of the portraits of our king and queen. I liked the little green metal contraptions high on the wall, which had a little metal fist holding a short rod on the outside. The boys used to lob their apple cores into them, and it was years later that I was told these mysterious fixtures were ventilators. Heaven alone knows what sort of insanitary mess was inside. I liked to hear the droning of the children next door beyond the pitch pine partition as they chanted their tables or learnt a poem. I liked to feel the warmth from the coal fire and to watch one of the big boys shoveling on the fuel when needed. I appreciated Mr. Clark's witticism, his tolerance, and his handling of the top standard boys who could have been obstreperous, so close were they to escape into the larger world. In fact, the place fitted me as snugly as a cocoon, and lapped in warmth, security, and friendship, I thrived as never before. As the dreaded scholarship examination drew nearer, I began to realize just how keenly I should miss my present surroundings. I had visited my sister's school in Bromley now and again, where there had been an open day or sports day, and of course had heard all about it from her. It was here that a few of us from Chelsfield School sat the examination one Saturday morning in spring. My heart sank at the sight of those long, stony corridors, the vast hall, the plethora of classrooms, and the expanse of playing fields. Everything was beautifully kept. The paintwork inside was glossy and white, a rare thing to find in a school. The parquet floors shone like satin. The glass in the doors and windows gleamed with cleanliness. There were neat flower beds set among mown lawns, and I longed for something smaller, shabbier, and familiar. In the year before, Margaret from the post office had become a successful pupil here, and Mr. Clark had told us in assembly how proud we should all feel. My heart had gone out to poor Margaret, compelled to stand alone before the school, enduring Mr. Clark's eulogy and, final horror, the clapping of her schoolfellows, but she was an equable child and bore it all fairly well. The result of my own efforts was not due until June, and I sensed that my parents were anxious. I hoped that I should not disappoint them, but I could hardly bear to think of leaving the village school. On the 17th of June, 1924, my parents received a letter to say that I had passed. The postman came about 8 o'clock, and I was in the garden feeding my rabbits before setting off for school. I can see their faces now, full of loving pride as they held up the letter and called the news to me. My sandals were wet with dew, my fingers sticky with bran mash, but I hope that I raised a smile to match their own. 2 terrible clouds hovered over me. I should be going to a school just like my first one. It would be big, noisy, and competitive. Examinations would loom larger every year. I should have endless possessions, 3 pairs of shoes, a satchel, a hateful uniform with a Panama hat in summer and a black felt in winter. I should be bound round with rules, pestered by prefects, goaded by ambitious schoolmistresses, harried to death. The second fear was more immediate. I should have to face the same horrors as Margaret. Would Mr. Clark take pity on me and let me off the public praise? Could I get him not to let the children clap? Could I pretend to be ill and stay at home, preferably in the bathroom? My mother wrote a note to Mr. Clark in case he had not yet heard the amazing news, and it was put in my pocket. She kissed me fondly as I set off. My father, wreathed in smiles, had already departed to Chelmsford Station. I made my way along the lane with my heavy burden. I walked past the violet beds, the walnut trees, the geese splashing in the pond, the shabby shed which had housed the shabbier firefighting barrel, and came within sight of the school. Vociferous and excited, my companions rushed about behind the railing, beneath the fluttering lime trees, their hair bobbing in the breeze. I fingered the letter in my pocket and mounted the school steps slowly. A shadow had fallen across my sunlit world. It was never to be quite so bright and carefree again. Epilogue. One winter morning, over half a century later, the telephone rang. One of the editors of a Sunday magazine asked if I would like to visit my old school and write an article describing it now, and when I attended it so many years ago. Of course, Chelsfield School sprang to my mind as I listened to further details of length, payment, deadline, and so on. Luckily, I had the forethought to ask who else was contributing to this feature. A few eminent names floated down the wire, including Laurie Lee. My heart sank. Of course, he would write about his village school in Gloucestershire, and with all the skill and charm which I so admired. "Tell me," I said, "Mr. Lee is writing about his village school, I suppose?" "Alas, no, it's been closed. He proposes to write about a later school which he attended." It's an ill wind that blows nobody any good. And I replied buoyantly, "In that case, I will visit my old village school in Kent and let you have the result." I traveled down from Charing Cross by train, passing through the old familiar stations. I did not go as far as Chelsfield Station, where I had first stood enraptured by early primroses and larks, for Nora met me at Orpington and drove me to her home at Well Hill. She was now a grandmother, with lots of fluffy white hair, but her smile and her voice were as gentle as when we first met at the age of 8. Now her grandchild was at our village school, and I should see her there the next day on my official visit. We woke to torrential rain and were off in good time, following the school bus. When it stopped outside the school, Nora and I waited in the car, watching the children mount those well-known steps to the playground above. On a morning such as this, we should have arrived in our mackintoshes, shoes soaking, hair dripping, and generally bedraggled. Our successors stepped dry and immaculate from the shelter of the bus. I followed them, half dreading what I should find after 50 years. Surely anything must be an anticlimax after the fond dreams I had nurtured for so long. To my delight, the basic structure was the same and the playground virtually unchanged, although a glass corridor ran along the back of the building where once Mr. Clark's small sons had climbed up on the desks to look into the classroom. His house, too, had been incorporated into the school, and the sitting room where he had lent me David Copperfield was transformed into the school kitchen. I felt uncomfortable there, as though I were a trespasser. I spent the day with those children and the kind and elegant young headmaster who showed me everything. It was still miraculously my old school, small, domesticated, secure, but wonderfully refined and beautified. Carpets covered the splintered floorboards whose shiny knots had reminded me of buttered hazelnuts. Bright pictures had taken the place of King George V and his wasp-waisted queen, and the children themselves were clothed in garments which would have been unimaginably chic to us. Two little girls discussed their ponies, and I remembered the awe with which my battered scooter had been greeted by my fellows in those distant days. School dinner was served, hot, fragrant plates full of well-cooked, properly balanced nourishment, although I noticed greens were still left on the rims. A far cry indeed from those lumps of print-grimed bread I so well remembered. There was so much to attract the eye. A tank of goldfish, shelves of bright books, enormous paintings being created with outsized brushes. I thought of the little boys who marched from Miss Ellis's class to Mr. Clark's so long ago, rulers sticking out from their thick socks so as they made their way to a session of mechanical drawing. How much luckier their descendants were. I spent a few minutes toward the end of the day alone in the wet playground. From inside, I could hear the hum of the school activities. The lime trees were still there, dripping. The cold Kentish air struck the flesh as keenly as it had always done. The gray roof glistened, the iron railings were beaded with bright drops, a pigeon came down to strut through the puddles, and I was 8 years old again. The end.